What message would you hope people get from listening to this podcast?
To me, it comes back to personal responsibility rather than offloading to just the experts. And I do think it's important to hear all opinions. And sometimes an expert might have a good opinion, but it's being very discerning with that and not just saying they're automatically right because they have a PhD
Mhm.
next to their name. And then realizing how much we can do in a relatively cheap manner by working on our consciousness, and whether it's meditation or whatever practices we need to do to try to reduce stress and to try to eat well and to try to be in a low toxin environment. There are things that are easy to change in one's life that can result in better health
Yeah.
versus you have to go to a doctor and take this pill that was developed in a lab as the
Mhm.
only solution.
Mark, it's lovely to see you again. Thank you for coming back on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Today, I'd like to talk to you about a different topic that kind of sits outside the other topics. So I'm kind of curious, why did you become interested in medicine? Because before it was consciousness, politics, and some other non-medical topics.
Well, actually, when I started my journey into the exploration of consciousness and the nature of reality, there were some health topics that came up because I heard about notions of energy healing and alternative ways of looking at health and disease, generally speaking. So this was back in 2016, where I was at least exposed to those ideas.
Mhm.
And then when everything happened starting in 2020, there were lots of medical questions, and I'll be careful with the words because I know on various platforms you can't say things, but
Yeah.
I started to look more closely at the medical system, and I saw a clear deception, and there were pieces of information that um, were easy to find outside of the mainstream, but were not being talked about in the mainstream. And that made me question all sorts of things early in 2020. But then in 2023, I was speaking at a conference in Tennessee, which was it's called Rebels for a Cause, hosted by Courtney Turner. And it was many different topics. So there were political topics. I spoke about the Great Reset and consciousness there. And there was a talk about viruses by Alex Zeck, who I had met separately a few months before, not in that context.
Hmm.
But after hearing some of his talk and talking to him about the notion of viruses and questions about virology in general, I then began looking into it more deeply. And there's a series called The End of COVID, which Alec and a few others put together. I
Yeah.
was a participant in it, but more on the political side.
Mhm.
And when that was released, and there's over 100 hours, I think, of content, theendofcovid.com. When that was released in the summer of 2023, I watched a bunch of the interviews that I was not involved in, and they were
Yeah.
asking fundamental questions about health and disease that I wasn't aware of. And that
Mhm.
is what spawned this whole thing.
Okay, that's interesting because that's kind of how we got together because I'm a good friend with Dawn Lester, and I'm pretty certain you've referred to her book and used her book, which is awesome.
Absolutely. Yeah. Don's book,
Yeah.
What Really Makes You Ill,
Yeah.
is an amazing book, and I cite it many times in my own book.
Excellent, excellent. So I have a question for you then. What is allopathic medicine?
The way I think about it is that it's defined by two primary characteristics. One is that it's reductionistic. It likes to just reduce everything to a single cause. So it might be a germ, and then we're going to create um, a medication for it, and then you're good to go. It's very simplistic rather than looking at multiple factors that could be involved.
Mhm.
And it also likes to look at symptoms rather than the root cause of disease. So if you go to a doctor and there's an ailment, the doctor just takes care of the ailment, but maybe the thing that caused that ailment or symptom hasn't been addressed. The allopathic system was, I would say, pushed in 1910 by the Flexner Report. And this is all publicly available stuff. And that basically reset the whole system of medicine in the West. Whereas previously there was more of a focus on holistic treatments and osteopathic ways of looking at things and
Mhm.
even homeopathy. The Flexner Report said, well, we need to move toward this allopathic system and change the whole medical approach.
Mhm.
So many of the topics that we'll probably talk about today might seem new in the modern medical climate, but they're actually ancient concepts that are just coming back and they seem novel.
Mhm. That's interesting. I read about the Flexner report and I talked about that in my book as well. Um, okay. So why do you think then allopathic medicine is so popular?
Part of it is that it is the predominant system that
Mm.
we are taught. So doctors are taught it, and then we listen to doctors, and the media listens to doctors. So it is proliferated as the truth. I also think there is some validity to it in certain circumstances, especially with regard to emergencies.
Mhm.
The allopathic approach can save lives. The question, however, is whether that approach should be applied generally to health and disease rather than just being the exception for emergencies.
Mhm.
So what happens, and this seems to happen with every paradigm, is that we find the things that work really well and hang on to those and then discount the parts that don't work as well and say, oh, well, just because we haven't figured out X, Y, and Z, rather than saying, well, maybe the paradigm is a problem rather than just those few anomalies.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. If the only tool you've got is a hammer, everything tends to look like a nail.
Well said.
I'm interested in your thoughts on the germ theory of disease when you compare it to the likes of terrain, as an example.
Mm. So I would say, in my journey of looking at medicine, this was the piece that pushed me over the edge to wanting to write,
Mhm.
that I learned about in 2023 for the first time, where the belief in mainstream allopathic medicine is that germs cause disease, meaning they're microscopic entities that launch attacks against healthy tissue.
Yeah.
And that sounds like such a basic thing, a basic truth of
Mm.
our reality. And I didn't realize there was an alternative because of essentially a logical flaw. And the analogy that many people use is to say that if you see firefighters at the scene of a fire,
Mhm.
do we conclude that the firefighters caused the fire, or that the fire has a mystical ability and it spawns these firefighters out of thin air? No, we come up with a different conclusion and say the firefighters are putting out the fire.
Yeah.
And it could be the same thing with the germ theory of disease, where we see lots of bacteria that are associated with a person's symptoms and feeling really sick. And we say, look, there's a bacterial infection. You have this overgrowth and the bacteria are the problem. However, it might be the case that the bacteria are there because of an underlying toxicity, and the bacteria act as a cleanup crew. In many natural settings, bacteria are known to be saprophytic, that they decompose dead and dying tissue, perhaps, or dead and dying material. Perhaps that's what's going on in the body, where the tissue is damaged for some reason, and the bacteria are actually a helpful microbe. And perhaps they emit toxins in the process. And if you have too much of anything, that could be a problem. But to say the bacteria are the root cause under this mentality would be erroneous.
Mm.
And this gets to more generally what you asked about terrain theory.
Mm.
Terrain theory is akin to growing a plant. You'd want the soil to be well taken care of, and then the plant will grow well. So it's comparing the terrain of the soil to the terrain of the body, that if the body is in good shape, physically and psychospiritually, then we'll be healthy.
Mm.
So it's much more looking at the internal aspects and toxicity and radiation and our psychological state of being, for example, rather than these external enemies that are out to get us.
That's interesting too. It also takes into account, doesn't it, nutrition? Are you getting all the building blocks you need?
Absolutely. That's a big part of it. And in Don Lester's book, What Really Makes You Ill, nutrition is a big part of what they look at. Of many diseases out there in the world that we consider to be infectious,
Mm.
for example, there are other causes potentially, such as poor nutrition, that can
Mm.
cause symptoms. So there are many other factors that we often don't look at because the allopathic system wants us to focus on these germs and not some of the things that we might be putting into our body or surrounding ourselves with.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. A good analogy for people might be if you want to make a chocolate cake and you have all the ingredients bar chocolate, you will have a cake, but it won't be a chocolate cake.
That's a good one. Hadn't heard
Yeah.
that.
Or another one, if you think about it this way, if you have some fish in a fish tank and the fish are getting sick, do you try and inoculate the fish? Do you give the fish medicine? Or do you first thing you do is say, look, what's happening in the water they're swimming in?
Exactly right.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's not
Okay.
what mainstream really wants to ask. And I think there are probably many reasons for this, but from just a basic business standpoint, there are financial incentives
Yeah.
toward the germ theory of disease, because if we can just come up with a medication to help you against this invisible enemy to save you,
Yeah.
that's a big moneymaker potentially, versus, hey, Adrian, why don't you just change your diet a bit and then you're going to be healthy? That's less profitable for the pharmaceutical industry.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think that one of the other things, it isn't just about the profit. One of the other sides to the equation that supports the allopathic medical industry is that people want to take a pill to fix a problem instead of taking responsibility that they've had a hand in creating the problem, either intentionally or otherwise.
Completely agree.
Another question then, and this is one that I spent quite a lot of time studying too, was the idea that what is a virus and how has it actually been studied? Because everyone assumes that, viruses make you sick. But when you really dive into that, some interesting things come up, don't they?
Yes, and I remember initially hearing this at the beginning of 2020 because there were some people, of course, who were questioning the agenda to inject everyone, and then there were a few people saying, "Yeah, all that's true, and viruses don't exist. That we've never isolated them before." So when I heard that initially, I said, "I mean, that sounds really fringy, but I can't dispute what they're saying because I don't know enough about viruses." So I put it off on the back burner, and it wasn't until more recently that I started to actually look at the arguments. And there is a fundamental question, like, how do we know that these entities exist and that they cause disease in people? And it becomes a question of the history of science, of how have people historically thought about
Yeah.
health and disease. And I didn't realize this, that until the 1930s initially, that was when the electron microscope was conceived. And that's the technology that's needed to be able to see something as small as a virus is believed to be. So prior to that, people were talking about viruses, but they couldn't even see that entity,
Mhm.
that alleged entity. Louis Pasteur, for example, when he was working with rabies, and then he was seeing symptoms, he said, well, there must be something there. I can't see what it is, but there must be something that's transmitted. Then fast forward to the 1950s, 1953, Watson and Crick, double helix structure of DNA, their paper came out. So now there was genetics, and that could be at least associated with illness. And then if you combine that with the research on bacteriophages, which the research on that won the Nobel Prize in 1969, but the work was done in the 1940s and onward. But these are entities that are seen when bacterial cultures are stressed. Now, in the mainstream, they would say that bacteriophages are parasites that infect bacteria. I've heard alternative perspectives which say that the bacteriophages are a stress response. But in any event, the bacteriophage became a model, and you can look at pictures of them and see that they're very similar to what viruses are alleged to look like. So bacteriophages combined with genetic material, now maybe we have something to explain this invisible enemy that's causing illness. Whereas in the past, the Greeks used the term eos, which meant a slimy poison. That's what a virus was, just a poison. And then it became a genetic intracellular parasite that gets inside of a host cell, replicates, can be transmitted from person to person, and is specifically responsible for the symptoms that we see. That was a model that is relatively recent.
Mm.
And the method by which that entity is believed to be isolated, this is where it gets into trickiness with terminology, because it all comes from a 1954 study, Enders and Peebles. Enders was a Nobel Prize winner later in that same year, so he became a prominent person, and that probably propped up the study that he did. But I will describe the very basic methodology. There's more complexity to it. But the researchers take a fluid sample from a sick person, and then they might filter it partially, but they've got fluids from a sick person. They put it into a cell culture, which is a soup of cellular material that contains all kinds of things. It has antibiotics, monkey kidney cells, and it depends on the experiment what exactly is in there. And when the experimenters add the fluids from a sick person to this soup of cellular material, sometimes they find that cells break down in the soup, and they say, look, there was a virus.
Get away.
That's the method. And clearly, there are many other explanations for why cells would break down. Number one, there's a lot of toxic substances in the cell culture soup. So you'd need to run studies to see, do cells break down without even adding an external substance? Secondly, what if there's something else in the fluids from a sick person other than an alleged virus that causes cells to break down? The problem here ultimately is that we don't just have a sample of viruses by themselves when they're added to the cell culture, because
Mhm.
that's really what you'd want to see, in addition to examining the cell culture substances.
Well, that
But
would
they
be
don't,
my understanding of isolation, which means to separate one thing from another.
that makes a lot of sense, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That's the common definition. Isolation means to separate from other things.
Yeah.
Tom Cowan, who's a medical doctor who talks about this, he said, look, if you have a toolbox and you want to study a hammer, you take the hammer out of the toolbox, you isolate it, and then you can characterize it. You can do all sorts of studies on the hammer, but first you'd want to isolate it. And it would seem to make sense you'd want to do that with a virus, because then if you have just a virus, you could see what effect it has on things. You could then sequence it. You could look at it under an electron microscope. You could do all sorts of things. But shockingly, that is not what's done. And there are many excuses made. The researchers will say, well, look, viruses are intracellular parasites. So they're inside the host cell. We obviously couldn't isolate it, but that begs the question, well, doesn't the virus have to get into the cell, and then wouldn't it leave the cell when it's spreading? Or they'll say, look, Adrian, you're being really picky. these viruses are just hard to isolate. They're really small, and it's hard to get enough of the virus to be able to do the experiment. And yet at the same time, they shut down the whole world on the basis of something that could be spread so quickly and easily. Just a little bit of it is enough to potentially kill you. So there are inconsistencies in the argument. There are excuses being made for not actually having a purified sample. Why is that a problem? Because if you don't have a purified sample, you don't have an independent variable in a scientific study. And if you don't have an independent variable, you can't run a proper control against that variable. Therefore, we're not conducting the scientific method, and therefore it is pseudoscience. That's the chain of events. Scientism.
Yeah.
It's a religious belief, essentially.
Yeah.
And if your audience is new to this, it was very new to me too. It's a shocking thing to realize, because the questions start to emerge. Well, how could the whole field of virology exist on all of this? And what I think happens is that the fundamental assumptions are not being examined. People presuppose things to be true, and then they study it from there.
That makes a lot of sense. What do you, I mean, they made a lot of noise about the PCR test and about antibodies, antigen tests and stuff. Could you talk a little bit about that?
The question with anything that is allegedly viral in nature, or supposed to be detecting something viral, is that if it's always working from an unpurified sample where there could be other things in it, then we don't know what they're testing for. That's fundamentally the problem. And if PCR is looking at genetic fragments, what are those genetic fragments? It could be that if someone is sick with a certain condition and has certain symptoms, then the body's producing a lot of cellular material very often in an attempt to detoxify. And then if you have a sample from that sick person, you might see that sort of material over and over again, which would then repeatedly show up on a genetic test like PCR. Another problem with PCR, however, is that Kary Mullis, who won a Nobel Prize for inventing it, he has said that it's a problematic test, that you can find anything because you end up amplifying the genetic sequence, and you can find things that aren't there. With regard to the antigens and the antibodies, to me, the problem goes back to what I said, that what are those antigens and antibodies corresponding to? They could consistently pick something up that's associated with certain symptoms, but we don't know that it's a virus that it's actually picking up. So the term of viral antibody or viral antigen, they might be misnomers. And the term that people often use is the reification fallacy, where we assume something exists and then we reify its existence by continuing to talk about it. So to say viral antigen, viral sequence, we're talking about it as if it's a real entity, and it hasn't been found to exist on its own yet. And then because of that perpetuation, we then continue to just think it's more and more real. And then it makes it harder and harder to believe that it could not be.
So you're talking it into being, basically. So if you tell a lie for long enough and with enough passion, it's pretty much easy to get most people to buy into it, isn't it?
It is. Both a lie, but then also innocent perpetuation of an idea of someone who just, this was what I was taught. And I do think it's probably some combination. I don't know who's doing what, though.
Yeah, absolutely. That's interesting. So polio, we're told it comes from a virus. What is your take on that?
My first question would be, do we have evidence that polio was isolated? And the problem with all viruses is that they're not actually isolating the substance. So that raises questions. Let's just say that the polio alleged virus is not there. People were getting sick, and they do get symptoms and people die. What is causing that? And there are many theories about this. The most popular one I've seen has to do with correlations in pesticide use, especially in the US in the mid 1900s. DDT, lead arsenate. Jim West wrote a book on toxicology and polio, effectively, where he shows increases in the uses of those pesticides, and it correlates with incidence of polio symptoms. And then when the pesticide use goes down, when people started to realize how toxic it was in insecticides, then the polio cases went down.
You've seen those videos and pictures, I'm sure, of people eating school lunches and stuff and being sprayed from the street. Yeah.
It was pretty crazy, but people didn't realize that how toxic it was.
No. And you have the same thing now, I think, with things like Roundup.
Totally agree. And then what happens is these injections are created to then allegedly cure it. And people say, well, that injection is the reason that the symptoms started to go away, and that's why polio went away. There are many problems with these sorts of arguments. One is, well, we know that there was a decrease in pesticide use that could explain it. But also it's possible that with regard to any alleged viral medication, that the medication could have some effect by preventing the body from detoxifying, or it could halt some system in the body whereby the symptoms don't come out as much. It might not cure the root cause, but it's not necessarily an antiviral per se. For example, chemotherapy and radiation. They might help someone of cancer symptoms, but it's not because those treatments are actually getting to the root cause of why the cancer's there.
Yeah. 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 That ties in with everything I've read as well. So what about the Spanish flu, which was a big killer?
Same problem with virus isolation. Do we know what was actually causing it? And there were some studies done by Milton Rosenau during the time of Spanish flu, where he tried to demonstrate contagion, and he had people cough in each other's faces and things like that, where you'd think that everyone would get sick, and no one was getting sick.
Yeah.
So there are questions, well, okay, if it's not a contagious pathogen, what was going on? And there are many different theories on this, and it really gets into the same things that Dawn talks about in her book, what really makes you ill. What are the, toxicity, electromagnetism, nutrition, stress, all of those could play into it. But there also were many injections that were given around that time. So there are people that correlate. Well, the people that were getting injected seem to have more of these symptoms. I just saw a post really recently by Dan Reuters, who wrote a book called Can You Catch a Cold? And he was talking about the uses of certain chemical substances in World War I that seemed to be correlated with various symptoms. I've also read in the book The Invisible Rainbow by Arthur Furstenberg. He talks about increases in electricity around the world. And around the time of Spanish flu, there were animals that were dying too, as the electricity grid essentially was increasing. So there could be that element to it. Ultimately, with any illness, I tend to look at things as being much more multifactorial rather than just this one single cause. And there might have been many factors going on at once at that time too.
Cool. That's really interesting too. And I think we may be on the toxicity side seeing similar sort of things by people with Gulf War syndrome, where there was big burns of all sorts of waste materials in the army bases, and the people in close proximity to that having all sorts of health issues as a result of the noxious chemicals and vapors they'd be exposed to and breathing in.
Exactly. But we don't hear about that in the mainstream medical community because they're so focused on the germ
Yeah.
hypothesis.
Yeah.
For the reasons we discussed, there's a lot of reason to want to
Yeah.
push it in that direction. So I can imagine if your audience is not familiar with some of these ideas, like I was, it's hard to believe. It's like, wait, could it be true that there were these other causes? But if we're deflected in a different direction with our consciousness, these other things just could get left.
Yeah. Okay. So that's interesting. So you talked about consciousness. So how do you think shifts in consciousness affect people's or impact people's health?
To me, this is fundamental. Well, from a practical standpoint, if someone has a shift in consciousness where they start to look at their own health differently, then they're going to make different choices about the toxins they're exposed to and differences in their diet. So the physical things they're exposed to are a result of their consciousness. So that's on a more traditional level. But from a more metaphysical level, which relates to our previous conversation, I think this is where it gets really interesting. Because if you look at cases like Anita Morjani, she had a near-death experience. She was in a coma for terminal cancer and encountered her deceased father, and she felt unconditional love for him, even though when he was living, she had problems with him. And she realized about herself that she was very judgmental in her life and that her internal condition, meaning her psychological state, was affecting her physical state. So when she came back and was resuscitated, her tumors disappeared. So she had a shift in consciousness or some kind of energetic experience, and it translated into a physical change, a disappearance of tumors. Her doctors couldn't understand it. So that one case alone, and there are many others, there's a whole set of spontaneous healings that was published by the Institute of Noetic Sciences, and this, anyone can look it up publicly, like in the medical literature, spontaneous healings. It doesn't match with the allopathic reductionistic way of looking at life. So that raises all sorts of questions.
Yeah, and it's definitely that was one of the paths that I went down years ago. It's really very interesting. If anyone watching this has, some questions in the mind, go and look for the answers. Don't accept what we're telling you. Just go look for your own answers, ask your questions, and I think you're in for a surprising treat.
I've also been interested in the field of German new medicine, which does relate to consciousness in a way where conflict shocks can correlate with physical symptoms. And Dr. Hammer discovered this in the late 1970s, where he found that there were lesions in the brain that were associated with certain symptoms or they're associated with a certain type of conflict that a person experienced. And then the lesion in the brain was correlated with a problem in an organ. So now what they can do in German new medicine is say, you have these symptoms, we know what the emotional conflict shock must have been that caused it. And when you have symptoms under this philosophy, it's your body actually expelling the buildup that it needed in order to handle the conflict. So the symptoms are part of the resolution under German new medicine.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And it also ties in with the work that Matthew Zoltan's doing with his natural meditation on the Undo app. I don't know if you caught any of the content I made with him, but that's fascinating too. And one of the things I found with that was that, for example, I always feel stress here in my kind of solar plexus area, which apparently is quite common for Virgos, which is what I am, or the birth sign that I have. What I found was when I started to address some of the pains and discomfort I had there, instead of questioning it, just to sit with it and to honor it and float with it, instantly memories would come up, very powerful traumatic memories from many years ago, decades, sometimes 4 and 5 decades ago. And in that moment, it's like you release all the tension that you've been holding in that area. And even when I try and think about that memory now, it doesn't have any kind of clarity to it. It's just fuzzy. It's not really there. So that I was talking to Matthew the other night about that, and I said that seems to tie together with the Germ new medicine that you're actually releasing that trauma. And so a lot of this stuff's hidden. It's just I wasn't aware of it because you get on with your life. I've got to get on with it and you move on. So all these things seem to tie together from it's like the same thing but from different kind of views.
Yeah, and it raises lots of challenges to the allopathic approach because it is such a physical approach.
Yeah.
And what you're describing, we're talking about is something that is psychological, intangible. I can't touch
Yeah.
a trauma, and yet it is resulting in something physical. And then when that trauma is resolved, like Anita Morjani,
Yeah.
or the psychological issues resolved, there's a physical change.
Yeah.
And it really speaks to the reductionism, and it relates to our previous conversation on scientific materialism.
Yeah.
I want to add one more point on this, which I think takes it even to another level of if reality is consciousness rather than physical at a core level, then that would imply that consciousness shifts the physical world in a tangible way. And there are studies on this where people are asked using their mind to try to influence the behavior of a machine, a random number generator that generates zeros and ones. And people are able to do this. This has been studied at Princeton. There are peer-reviewed papers on this where they change the behavior of a machine in a statistically significant manner. So what does that tell you? If we just accept some of those studies, that the mind is physically impacting the world without touching anything. And what does that mean? If our body's a physical thing, then what happens if our consciousness shifts?
Yeah, that's a really thought-provoking concept.
It's mind-blowing. It changes
No, it really
everything.
is. It's one of those you sit down and go, oh.
Let me take it a step further.
Yeah.
The Global Consciousness Project has looked at this on a collective scale where they set up machines all over the world generating zeros and ones, and they look at what happens to the behavior of the machines when there's a global event like 9/11, Princess Diana's death, many others. And they find that the machines often behave non-randomly when there's a major global event, which suggests that perhaps when there's a collective shift in consciousness, even if people aren't aware of it, they're not trying to change the machines, that there is an effect on physical systems.
Yeah, Greg Braden talks a lot about that. Yeah, his work's very interesting too. I came across that 25 years ago. I started studying that. Really interesting stuff.
Yeah, it is.
Cool. So I have a question for you then. Why did you write the book?
I felt like this was really important and I wanted to share it. That's why I've written all the books, is that I have a paradigm shift on my own and I say, it would really, I know how much this has helped me. If I just summarize it for people and give them a launching off point, then maybe it will help other people too. That's what happened here too.
Cool. So where can they find the book?
The book is on Amazon. It's available in paperback, Kindle, and Audible. And I think it's hopefully a good starting point on this topic. There are lots of sources cited, hundreds of citations, because some of it is hard to believe at first. Let me give you one more example. Like, I said, could it really be true? They're not isolating the virus and there's no independent variable. And then I saw the work of Christine Massey, who with her colleagues has been submitting freedom of information requests to government organizations all over the world saying, this is what isolation means. I'm not talking about a cell culture. Show me the isolation of this virus. And they come back saying, we don't have results for this. And with regard to SARS-CoV-2, they've submitted these requests to over 200 institutions in 40 countries, including the CDC, and they don't have answers. So things like that is what I summarize in the book.
Okay, that's really interesting. Thank you. Yeah, I'll thank you for that. I'll give people a little clue. I'll be 60 this year. I haven't seen a doctor in 35 years because I've never felt the need to go to the doctor. That doesn't mean I never get sick. Of course I get sick. I'm involved or exposed to environmental toxins, but I eat what I can eat that I think is appropriate. I grow what I can grow when I can grow it. I drink the cleanest water I can get. I try and keep my life free from stresses and stuff like that. But invariably life comes at you and happens to you. And every once in a while, your body says, now's a really good time to have a detox. And I've had some doozies in the last few years, way more than I've ever had before, and some really, really uncomfortable ones. But I trust that this that was created between a sperm and an egg and then grew from that and is constantly refreshing and rejuvenating itself all the time. So you're replaced all the time. That it is capable, if I do my bit to try and create the right internal and external environment, and that also includes relationships with others and with myself, that hopefully it knows what to do in order to keep it running. And that seems to be what's happening. So I've never felt the need. In fact, recently I saw a doctor and he said, well, who are you registered with? And I went, I'm not. And he couldn't wrap his head around it that I hadn't seen one in 35 years. And I said, look, if I feel the need to come and get that kind of information, I will. But I've found different information that seems much better suited to me and my family, that we just don't need access to that because Clive DeCarle said it really well. He said he doesn't know anyone that is pharmaceutically drug deficient. So I think for me, that's the kind of bit that is my guiding principle on this, that there's always a way to do this naturally. There's a way that you can do. You can get more information, you can get access to more stuff, and your body knows how to fix itself. And if you don't believe me, go get a cut, which we all get all the time. Don't pay it any attention and see if it heals. As long as you keep it clean and you don't get junk in it, it'll heal up. So,
Yeah, it's recontextualizing a symptom. A symptom is the body's way of handling something
yeah,
naturally versus the
yeah,
enemy.
yeah, that's right. Yeah, brilliant. Fantastic. That was awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.